Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā toko te tau. That's mihi in Maori. I come from New Zealand, and my talk may be extremely undistinguished, but you do have one mark of distinction here, which I'm sure I am the person from the furthest south that has ever spoken here, at least in this centre and probably at Bonn. I was brought up in Dunedin, Queenstown, and educated at Invercargill, which is difficult to get further south than that. And I'm absolutely delighted to be here to be a keynote speaker at this very auspicious event. I'd like to say that I've flown especially for this event from Melbourne, but that reality is a little bit more prosaic. I'm currently a fellow at the Robert H. Smith Centre for Jefferson Studies at Monticello and Virginia, and was last week organising a conference where Michael Zuzki was at on Eric Williams at 75 at the University of Liverpool and the International Slavery Museum in Liverpool. I was also last week at a conference on modern slavery at the institute where I will be director at the Wilberforce Institute for the Study of Slavery and Emancipation at the University of Hull. And I mentioned these because these are the sorts of places and the sorts of things which will enable linkages with this wonderful centre. And I'm certain that just as the links between the Bonn Centre for Dependency and Slavery Studies and my current institution in Australia will be strong as well. And I must say here that we were also going for a cluster of excellence bid. We unfortunately did not win, so we don't quite know the joy of excitement that happened in September in 2018 that you experienced. We do know the pangs of disappointment after putting in all that sort of work. But hopefully, I would imagine that the work that has been done there will continue in the future. And I think it also will be a way whereby my new institution can have a connection with this centre as well. My new centre is about the study of both historical and contemporary slavery, and I think we need to remember that slavery and multiple forms of dependency are far from gone in today's world, and we need people to emulate the person after whom my professorship is named, William Wilberforce, and the great abolitionist from the 1820s, to make sure that in the 2020s the scourge of modern slavery and its equivalents is gone from the world. That will be a daunting task. There are perhaps 40 million people in forms of coerced bondage or some sort of form of exploitation that resembles slavery today. But that's a small percentage of the 7 billion people in this world, and getting rid of modern slavery is something that we could do. And certainly this centre will help in advancing not only the claims for getting rid of modern forms of exploitation, but for helping us to understand the deeper ways in which exploitation of people in all places and all times has occurred, and help move us to a place where that exploitation is a little bit less. And certainly I think at the moment we are realising, as we see at least in Britain, with tragic headlines over various types of dreadful stories in terms of human migration and human trafficking, that the types of themes that BCDSS are doing is very important. One thing I would say here is that it's been interesting for me being a fellow at Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, also the home of the Charlottesville riots in 2017 when Jefferson was taken as a symbol, much to the distress of the people at Monticello, as a symbol of white supremacy. Something which very much distressed them because they're spending a great deal of time working out the very complicated but important relationship between Jefferson, the author of the major creed of American history, and also a slave owner and someone who had a long-term relationship with a enslaved woman whom he owned and with whom he had children. That in Monticello, this subject is very fraught. I think that a centre like this would probably be impossible to have in America, possibly even in Britain, although I think there are many institutions there which are coming to terms with the historical legacy of slavery, but that it is in Germany, in a major centre, major university such as the University of Bonn, I think means that this is the ideal place, the ideal time, and the ideal group of scholars to study some very important things. So I'd like to salute you for your achievement, and it's a very great honour for me not only to be present at this very auspicious event today, but also to be a Heinz Heinen Fellow coming here in May. And you might be wondering why I'm going to do something which seems seems to be so small in scope. Looking at a obscure, well, not that obscure, but at least a very particular political moment in late 17th and 18th century Britain, when the monopoly of a Royal African Company was overturned and free trade in slaves were occurring in this period. Well, what I'm going to do, I guess, is something that historians often like to do, which is to take a small subject, this particular end of a Royal African Company, and to claim world historical significance for it. And the world historical significance that I want to claim is the following: is that this was one of the movements in two events of world historical transformation, and that these happened, I think, over a long period, but particularly over the late 17th and 18th century. They expanded and increased dramatically. And that was the rise and establishment and power of the great planter class of the Americas, the first and most important ruling elite in the history of the United States and the history of the Americas, whose legacy continues very much to the present day. It's notable that the current President of the United States, whose name perhaps we won't mention, does have a southern mansion that has some sort of echoes, I think, of the great planters of this particular period. So one of the things I'll be looking at today will be the rise and consolidation and power of what, in America anyway, is called the 1% over the 99%. And secondly, I think what I want to look at today is the rapid change in trajectory in the in the Americas, and British America, but America in general in this period, from places which were relatively egalitarian and getting more egalitarian to places which were less egalitarian than ever before. Some of that changes in egalitarianism happened to ordinary white men and women, who we focus a lot of what I'll be talking about today. But we need to keep in mind that the brunt of the troubles that occurred and the brunt of the miseries that accompanied the rise of the great planters, the rise of the 1% as opposed to the 99%, went to happened with the enslaved people, the men, women, and children brought over from Africa in the late 17th century and increasingly in the 18th century, the 12 million people who embarked and the 11 million people who arrived in one of the great crimes of history. And one of my contentions would be that this is a period that was the nadir of the enslaved experience in the Americas, that was associated very much with the rise of the great plantation, the rise of great planters, and that the demise of the Royal African Company in the 1672 to 1708 played a part of it. So it very much connects with Stefan's comments to me, and I'd like to very much congratulate you, Stefan, for this great achievement, for you, your team, and all the administrators here for this particular centre. But it chimes in with one of Stefan's comments in introducing me, is that in these contingencies of history, some of these small events, some large-term consequences can emerge. Now, I do note that I have a great problem right from the start in defending the Royal African Company, because it is indefensible. This is a firm which traded in human flesh, which traded in selling African produce, and by African produce they meant human beings, to the Americas from 1672 to 1708. It was headed by the Duke of York, later James VII and II. For those of you who know anything about British history, he is one of the least impressive of a whole number of very unimpressive British monarchs. I can say that in Germany, I wouldn't say that in Britain. But essentially I'm defending a monopoly. That's always a bad thing. No one likes monopoly. A monopoly of a company that sold humans. That's about as bad as you can get, headed by one of the worst and most hated kings in British history. So, why do I want to do that? Well, I guess first thing I would say about it, and here gives you a little summary of the talk that I'm going to do. I always like to give a summary of the talk at the start, so that if people want to catch up on their sleep during the rest of the talk, they have at least some idea of what I'm talking about, and they can wake up and ask me questions, seeming very well informed just from these various things here. So you can read this while I'm talking, etc. One thing I want to say, I guess, it's the obvious one, is that We don't want to apply, of course, the perspectives of the values of today to a different economic environment. The end of the monopoly of the Royal African Company, one which was a very political event in Britain in the late 17th, 18th century, led to no improvements in the human condition. But those improvements wouldn't have occurred anyway. In other words, this was a period, it's important to remember, when the institution of slavery was recognised by everyone, at least everyone in Europe, as both a natural, inevitable and desirable institution. Everyone in Britain and its colonies agreed that to make the plantations of America profitable, one key ingredient was the provision of a regular and reliable trade in slaves to America, especially to the booming islands of the British Caribbean, especially to Jamaica, a place which I thought I'd do a bit of study back 30 years ago, and I've never managed to quite escape studying that very fascinating and important island. An island nowadays which has little purchase in world affairs, but in the 17th and 18th century was a jewel in the British crown. And I think one of the things you can say is that without slavery, the Americas would not have developed. It's one of the central truths of American society, that it was slaves and the products that enslaved people produced, notably sugar, that thing that we all desire, even though, and I point to my girth here, as something that we rather regret. Many of us Europeans have a very sweet tooth. Those sorts of, the slavery made the Americas rich, made the Americas profitable. Silver did pretty well in Spanish America, but in other places it was enslaved people and the produce they produced which made America work. The slave trade would have continued whatever happened in this particular period. But what I want to argue is that the Royal African Company put forward in the late 17th century, in its particular way that it brought enslaved peoples to Americas, was enabling a different type of Americas to emerge. In particular, it impeded the implementation of a transition to full-scale plantation agriculture, the rise of the large plantation for a full generation. That might not seem very long, but it was a generation which points to a different way that America could have emerged. It could have been a society, perhaps like Cuba in the middle of the 18th century, where slavery existed, but where slavery was mainly enslaved people were mainly owned by small planters, not always producing plantation agriculture, and where the wealth of the richest and the poverty of the poorest might have been less. And so in some ways what I want to do is just say something very small in talking about how this particular abolition of a monopoly, and I won't go much through the politics of it all, but except to say that large merchants in Britain, combined with Whig politicians, people who represented the opponents of James II, to make sure that the Royal African monopoly was stopped in the 1690s, and particularly in 1708. That's all really you need to know about the end of monopoly. But what they did, therefore, was to transform the Americas from a place where small planters might have succeeded, where small plantations and non-plantation agriculture might have been more important, and where, most importantly, the experiences of the enslaved might not have been quite so bad as they ended up being. And here's a couple of quotes talking about what the benefits of the Royal African Company were. Bearing in mind, once again, that defending this particular company is something which is very uncomfortable. What we could say that in the 17th century, between 1672 and 1708, the Royal African Company provided benefits to the British America. The Royal African Company, just very quickly, was founded in 1662 in order to bring the produce of Africa to the Americas. The principal product that they brought were enslaved people. Those enslaved people served on the plantations in the Americas, and the Royal African Company brought about 40 to 50,000 enslaved people to the Americas, mostly to Barbados, the small island in the Caribbean, which was the centre of the plantation revolution, the centre of a model of exploitation which developed throughout British America, then into French America, Danish America, Dutch America, and eventually into Spanish America, and then back to Brazil, from which the Barbadian model first emanated. They brought these large numbers of enslaved people, never enough to satisfy Barbadians and Jamaicans in the 17th century, brought them to the Caribbean, where they were sold usually in small parcels to relatively ordinary white planters, and put to work in plantations. What this happened with, therefore, was that in Barbados, in Jamaica in particular, the development of a plantation agricultural system delayed the transition to a mature plantation system for quite a long period. And that's quite significant, because Jamaica was a colony ideally suited for large-scale plantation agriculture, in which African chattel slavery was emplaced and unquestioned as a foundation of economic prosperity. It took over half a century for the mature plantation complex characteristic of the 18th century to emerge. Its social structure in the 1670s and 1680s, when the monopoly of the Royal African Company was strongest, in other words, when it was sending 70% of the enslaved people to the Americas that had arrived in the Americas in this period, was very different from what it became from the early 18th century. It was, like its counterpart in the Chesapeake, and like the model of a plantation society emerging in Barbados, a place where ordinary white men had considerable opportunity, and where there was considerable contestation between them and an embryonic large planter class about the direction of the colony. The Royal African Company helped prevent large planters from getting what they wanted for 30 years. The transition to a fully fledged plantation system thus was neither immediate nor inevitable, and the collapse of the Royal African's monopoly in 1708 played an important role in one vision of Jamaica's future prevailing over another vision in which the rich were not so conspicuously winners in the terrible transformation to a brutal, if very profitable, system of racial domination and rule by the very rich over the poor. Now, what I hope you're thinking at the moment is a question is, so what? 30 years doesn't make that much difference. So it would have happened anyway. And that's many ways, I think, the way that we think about slavery in the Americas. We think that the way that slavery developed in the Americas, the way that it had to develop, that it had to be one which was racial slavery. And I think one of the advantages of this particular centre is that it expands our idea of enslavement and dependency away from what is, I think, a sometimes narrow focus just on race and racial capitalism that's often current in American and British studies of slavery. And it also suggests that slavery did not have a history. One of the problems, I think, when we talk about slavery is we see it as a timeless institution. And often, of course, there are things in favour of that. In slavery, enslaved people do have common characteristics over all times and place. But I think one of the challenges for us as a generation looking at slavery in the Americas and elsewhere more closely is to distinguish the particular contingencies and the particular historical circumstances which made slavery as it was. And one of the things I want to sort of suggest is that slavery could have turned out differently in the Americas than what it did do. In particular, it could have been a slavery which was small scale, intimate, family orientated, and I realise that these are all sort of things which suggest that it was a good thing. It wouldn't have been a good thing whatever, but it would have been better than what did emerge, which was the rise of the large integrated plantation. The large integrated plantation was one of the great economic success stories of the 17th and 18th century. It was a place where all the operations of the plantation were put under one heading. In other words, both the production, the manufacturing, and the sale of the goods that were produced by enslaved people, most notably sugar, to Europe. It involved large number of enslaved people, gangs of 200, sometimes 300 or more, working in unison, growing sugar in conditions of great hardship. I've often said to my students that if you were to choose one thing to be, you would not want to be a Jamaican sugar worker in, say, 1720. And I would like to, like that was one of the things I'd like to emphasise, that what happened is that between 1680 and 1720, slavery became appreciably worse for the larger number of Africans who arrived in this period into places like Jamaica, even though the things that they produced became more important over time. The Royal African Company, as the primary source of getting enslaved people in the 17th century, was an extremely powerful institution. As Governor Francis Russell of Barbados put it, the agents of the African Company carry sway here as almost to stop any proceeding, for if a man does not vote as they would wish for a vestryman or assemblyman, they proceed against him for what he owes them for Negroes. Governor William Beeston, a little bit later on, talked about how company agents, when they had to choose between perhaps becoming an agent or working in politics, would choose to be a company agent because the profits were so much greater. In other words, this was an institution, a monopoly, which played an important role not only in providing enslaved people to Jamaica, Barbados, to Chesapeake and other sorts of places, but in the politics of the period. And they were a much hated institution, as you can imagine, because it stopped planters from doing what they most wanted. And one of the reasons they were most hated was that they provided not just benefits to grape planters, but they provided benefits to the institution as a whole. Now, it seems very strange things to say about an institution, a monopoly headed by a hated king trading in human flesh, but it was a public-spirited organisation. But indeed it was so. There's Charles Davenant in 1709, just after the monopoly rights of the Royal African Company had been ended, wrote a fierce polemic saying that this was a very bad thing, and that this was something which was put forward by self-interested politicians for their own gain. One of the things I'd like to argue, and I could get this is in a larger project here, is that this was a self-interested example of rent-seeking, of trying to get an economic advantage by a small group of closely connected merchants who transformed the Royal African Company into a free trade organisation, mostly for their own benefits. In the late 17th century, however, Royal African Company provided quite a lot of benefits to the colonies. In particular, it provided money. It provided large amounts of credit for people who wanted to buy enslaved people, which meant that ordinary people could buy enslaved people at almost as easily as rich people could buy enslaved people. It meant that rich people could not dominate the market and buy as many enslaved people as they wanted in order to transform their societies into the large integrated plantation, which was so economically effective but so socially disastrous. So it provided credit for small planters. It made Africans affordable, and I apologise, of course, for the crass way that I'm talking about humans as property, but that, of course, is what they were. But it meant that enslaved people were affordable for ordinary people who could borrow money from the Royal African Company. The problem with the Royal African Company is that very few of these planters ever paid them back, so they're hugely in debt, which is one reason it got broken up. It enabled a strong non-plantation economy. It meant that the West Indies did not have to become just a sugar place. It could have been societies which were devoted to a range of products, and it kept slaveholding small and slavery intimate rather than industrial. So why did it end? Well, fairly simply, James II got turfed out in 1688 for a glorious revolution. His company was therefore really much up against it. It was financially in debt. And the people who were wanting to move into the lucrative African market in order to bring over enslaved people to the Americas got the political upper hand. But we can see that it had some, what you might say, some significant effects. If we look at slave prices, which I've done for some time, it's a strange sort of hobby, but to look at slave prices and how they changed from the 17th century to the 18th century shows that one of the key things about slavery in the 18th century is that enslaved people became more valuable. They became more expensive to buy, and they appreciated over time. So therefore it became, from the early 18th century, highly advantageous for those people who had money, who already had enslaved people, to buy more enslaved people. And you can see from these figures here, that the average price jumped from £18 in the 1680s to £31 to £60 by the 1780s. And it meant that slave prices increased even more than the prices of sugar. And the economic one of that is that shows a society's coming into equilibrium. But what it showed, I guess, one is the value of enslaved people and how it was important to invest in enslaved people. Helps to explain why over 1 million slaves were landed in Kingston in this particular period. Helps explain also how sugar came to be so important, increasing 40-fold in European consumption during the 18th century. It also led to a change in buying slaves. In the 17th century, the Royal African Company, when they came to have a slave ship sent to Jamaica or to Barbados or to Virginia, would land and would have slave sales which were essentially retail. In other words, if you go through the slave sales, you'll find that there were a large number of purchasers, most of whom bought those enslaved people on credit from a Royal African Company and bought 2 or 3 slaves at a time. By the middle of the 18th century, the structure of the sales of enslaved people had changed dramatically. And so in some ways what we can see is a change of a business organisation. In 1751-52, for example, 31 ships came from Africa, were sent from London to Africa and came to Jamaica, carrying over 7,000 enslaved people. 83% of those 7,000 slaves were sold. Were given to 3 major merchant houses, who then sold them on to Jamaican planters. And this has 2 important consequences. Firstly, it meant that there was a concentration of slaves among the elite of Jamaica and other countries as well. These merchants would only sell enslaved people to those people who had sufficient credit to be able to justify selling them. Ordinary people got moved out of the market. And just as importantly, for enslaved people, it meant that enslaved people were mixed up. In other words, when a merchant bought a large number of enslaved people, he would take those slaves, take them to his house in Kingston, and then people would come. They would parade them at the top of the house. And then they would choose their enslaved people. Some of those enslaved people would come from the Congo, some would come from the Gold Coast, some would come from the Bight of Benin and the Bight of Biafra. It meant that Jamaican slave populations, and the same thing happened in Cuba and in San Domingue, other areas where similar processes worked out, were all sent to plantations where their mixtures of African ethnicities had to create Africa from a collection of different places. How enslaved people were sold had a very important effect, therefore, I think, about the creation of African-American, Afro-Caribbean periods in this area. And it meant, of course, that Kingston, one of the largest cities in the Caribbean, and certainly the wealthiest city in British America, if you take the wealth of the largest merchants, became incredibly important. If we looked at Havana, if we looked at Rio de Janeiro, and to an extent if we look at Charleston, we'd see some of these same things emerging. So what you see is an alliance between the wealthy merchants and wealthy planters in order to keep out less wealthy people. And here's one of the major traders in 1751, Thomas Hibbert. This no longer exists, but this is his funeral monument looking out in St Mary's in northern Jamaica out towards the Caribbean Sea. Shows something about the wealth of these people. The wealthiest people, wealthiest merchants and the wealthiest planters. Hibbert was a wealthy merchant. Left estates of £200,000-300,000. That's about as much as what a duke would have had in the 18th century, and meant that they became the first of a group, the first group to ever enter into London, to be able to outsell and outbuy ordinary aristocrats, provoking both admiration and a degree of resentment at the same period. As we might say here, that these are therefore what happened in this period was not a triumph of free trade over monopoly. It was not a triumph of a glorious revolution, but points to a period in the late 17th and 18th century where two things were occurring. One, as mentioned here, is how large merchants and large planters within Britain, in particular, but in the Americas in general, accumulated all things to themselves. The second thing as well about that, I guess, is that the arguments put forward by some economists that the Glorious Revolution was wonderful because it created institutions which made Britain democratic and kept it from revolution and all those sorts of things, arises out of actually some tawdry double-dealing and self-seeking in the early 18th century. And that double-dealing was focused very much about how do we get more enslaved people into the Americas and how do we make sure that those enslaved people go to our friends, the large planters and merchants, than anything else. As Nadir says, a small commercial elite was able with crown collusion to secure rent-seeking enterprises and fight expensive wars with higher input prices and risky trading conditions while plantation produce stalled and European rivals began a process of rapid catch-up. So what? I mean, so I've told in very, very sketchy detail a tawdry tale of rent-seeking, of economic advantage put forward by a few highly placed people in the late 17th century, where they managed to get lots of money for themselves. Some of these people became very important people within British society. As both Zahedia and Pettigrew, for example, both of them highlight the remarkable career of a man named Sir Gilbert Heathcote, someone who used a campaign against the Royal African Company to gain money for himself, becoming adept at using Parliament to uphold personal economic interests. When he died in 1733, he had a fortune of £700,000 that probably made him the richest commoner in England. And much of that money came from Jamaica, where he was an associate of the leading traders in London at that period, and he was influential in supporting these merchants and their large planter allies in taking control of the island's politics in the 1690s and 1700s. He was a prominent Whig opponent of monopolies and a man who was made rich through connections with Jamaica and through lending to the government as an army contractor and investor and director of the Bank of England. Well, in some ways you might say this is a familiar story. People claiming to be acting on principle in order to advance themselves economically, people amassing all sorts of political advantage in order to enrich their friends and themselves, and developing slavery in the process. I think there are some larger points that I'd just like to sketch out in the remainder of the time that I'm talking about. The campaign against the Royal African Company in the 1690s and 1700s might have been about the benefits of free trade over monopoly, might also have been about how to increase the benefits of slavery as people universally saw them in Britain and in Europe to the Americas, so that more enslaved people could get there, so that more enslaved people could work on plantations and more profits could go to merchants, and more products which were useful like sugar, tobacco, rice and indigo could be sent there to Britain. The proponents of the ending of a Royal African Company's monopoly saw it as a virtuous circle. Everybody won. As I'll point out, not everybody won, obviously, in this particular thing, but it also led, I think, to some truly dramatic transformations and consequences in the Americas. The most important one was that the winners from this particular period were the rich, the 1%, the great planters of the American South and of the British West Indies. And the picture we have here, which is a plantation idyll, is often associated with men like William Byrd, one of the leading planters in Virginia at this particular period, who talk very much about how they live in harmony with nature, creating a lovely sort of society which is very much like the rural aristocratic of society of England, recreating England in the New World. What you'll notice from this lovely painting is the thing that sustained that plantation, the enslaved men, women and children who worked on these areas. Oh, I don't know what's happened here. Sorry, the password seems to have gone again. I'm not quite sure what goes there. That they all worked, they all moved away. What we can say about is that all we need to do? Thanks. What we can say about these is that this was a group of people that became the most important ruling class in American history. A ruling class that lasted not only from round about the 1700 to at least to 1865, and echoes of those then later on. This is when you go to places like Monticello or plantation houses in Louisiana, or all the various places from Virginia south and from George Washington onwards, who dominated American society. The origins of their wealth and power came from these transitions in the late 17th and early 18th century. The demise of the Royal African Company was not the sole reason why these people ended up getting large amounts of money and power in this particular period, but it was a crucial element. In other words, the ability of the largest planters in Virginia and in the Caribbean to be able to get the majority of enslaved people was very important. So they're the largest winners. The other winners, of course, were large transatlantic merchants in London. And we could talk a little bit about those as well. Those large transatlantic merchants in London established commercial networks that kept them very powerful all throughout the 18th century. If we have a look at the commercial rise of London in this particular period, it's very much associated with their ability to control the flow of Africans through to the Americas. The third group that already became powerful were existing slave owners. And I think also we need to mention as well that this was also very good for African merchants, because African merchants who were involved in the slave trade were able to compete against separate traders, in other words, smaller planters, smaller merchants coming into Africa, and charge larger prices for the enslaved people that they had. It encouraged them to enter into slavery in a greater stage. And of course, Walter Rodney famously talks about how in the early 18th century, through the rest of the 18th century, Europe underdeveloped Africa by encouraging African merchants to think of the slave trade as the only trade worth having. And because African merchants could sell enslaved people for larger prices than they were able to do so before, that sort of happened. The second one I might want to talk about is who were the losers in this particular example. The first one, of course, is that the first loser was James the Seventh and his James the Seventh and the Second, who was in charge of the Royal African Company at this particular period, and they lost out in British politics. The most important losers, of course, were the enslaved, though we need to keep in mind that they would have lost anyway. Just because they moved from small-scale slavery to large-scale slavery did not mean that the enslaved people, that there would not have been slaves in the Americas. I wouldn't want to argue that. I wouldn't want to argue that in the late 17th, 18th century, America might have gone from a place which didn't have slavery to a place that did have slavery. But what I do think is important is that we need to think about what type of slavery that there was there. And we'll see if we can still carry on with these ones here. Thank you. Brilliant. Thank you very much. I hope you'll notice my sang-froid as all these things went by. But what I want to say is that in the 18th century, we enter into a period where slavery is particularly bad. Now, to describe slavery as being better or worse in some period rather than the other is a fool's game. Enslavement is bad for all people at different times, and psychological pressures of enslavement, say in the mid-19th century America, where enslaved people were very much put under huge psychological pressure from their planters. Was that better or worse from the early 18th century, when the major problems that enslaved people faced were the threat and reality of constant punishment, the threat and reality of constant malnourishment, and having to work very hard? I think certainly one of the things we can say is that the early 18th century saw in British America a type of slavery emerging in the large unintegrated plantations, which were the benefit of the 1% of the population, white people always, who owned slaves, which was a particularly pernicious form of slavery, and particularly in regard to the material well-being of slaves. I've worked with economists. It's always an interesting experience. Worked with economists in order to work out living standards of enslaved people in Jamaica in the 18th century. And what we see is that one of the results of the changes to a large integrated plantation society in Jamaica is that Jamaica becomes the most unequal place on earth. Americans often like to claim in the 18th century that their country, which was not yet a country, was the most equal place in the world. If you add Jamaica into the mix, which I think you have to do because Jamaica was as much America as was Massachusetts up until the American Revolution, you see something very different. What you see, I think, people like Thomas Hibbert earning £200,000, having a estate of £200,000 from the sale of enslaved people. You see average slave owners living very well on average incomes of a couple of £1,000s a year, and you see enslaved people having to live on what was the equivalent of £3 or £4 a year, which was half the amount that a peasant in France and a third of what an agricultural worker in Britain had to earn in this period. So what the end of the Royal African Company started to instigate, what was developed in places in Jamaica were societies of enormous inequality, great dependency, highly asymmetrical relationships, and societies in which enslaved people suffered more than anywhere else, not only physically from punishment, but also from lack of well-being. We see, therefore, in this period the rise of the large planter elite, the decline of the small planter class, and the establishment of large plantations in which the suffering of the enslavement was enhanced. And I just want to say a little bit about the small planter elite in this period, because one of the losers from this was the ordinary white man, who no longer could afford to buy enslaved people in the way that he could do before, was unable to attain that dream of independency which brought many people from Britain to the Americas. How did they cope? Well, one way they coped was to be incorporated into the plantation economy as the managers of enslaved people, which was a hard and difficult job, because you were having to control large numbers of enslaved women and especially men, many of whom had military training and who were not very pleased about being enslaved and living in the Americas. How did they manage to persuade people to do so? Well, one of the things that Edmund Morgan, whose book American Slavery, American Freedom is one of the great books in American history, put forward in 1975, which I think can be outlined as a consequence of the type of changes that I'm talking about in the late 17th and 18th century. One of the things was a bargain. They worked in the plantation economy. They received high wages, and they also received the relatively large psychological benefits of being white in a society where whiteness counted for everything and blackness counted for nothing. So one of the things I also think we see, not necessarily as a consequence of the demise of the Royal African Company, but occurring around the same stage, is a new and more pernicious kind of racial capitalism. Racial capitalism which was based very much on whiteness over blackness. And it's for this reason that that when we think of slavery, we automatically think, I think, turn to the idea of African slavery in the Americas and race being central to it. I think also that it says something that finally we could talk about in terms of slavery and British, and I think to an extent to European capitalist development. One of the things I think we're increasingly aware of is that the development of slavery in the early 18th century Americas is intrinsic to those changes in capitalist development that occurred in the 18th century. It might be correlation is not causation, of course, but I don't think it's entirely an accident that Britain came to be the wealthiest, most powerful nation of the world at the same time as they were developing a slave system in the Americas, which brought certain key actors within its society great wealth. And we need to remember that this was something which was very important for most of the 18th century. As the Trinidad and Tobago politician and great historian Eric Williams talked about slavery in this period, the importance of slavery in this period is that everybody accepted it. They accepted it not only as a natural good, but as something which benefited British geopolitically and British economically in this period. William Pitt the Elder talked about sugar planters in this way. He thought they should be thought of the same way as the landed interest of this kingdom. It was a barbarism to consider them otherwise. And I think that's important in regards to the types of things that the centre that you've established at Bonn are trying to work out. Is that there was a close correlation between various types of ruling elites, whether or not they were involved in slavery or not, and the values that were being espoused in the 18th century, which were based on the exploitation of slavery. Which means that you have in this period planters in power. In the 18th century, planters are crucial in the West Indies and in British America as well. Remember that of the first seven presidents, I think 5 are planters. And of course, the George Washington, the most famous and best American president. I must say, at the present day, one of the big winners from the current presidency is James Buchanan, because he'll go from 44th and last to 44th and second last in estimations of American presidents. But George Washington will still stay at the top, and he's a plantation in power. And here we have the now demolished, but the buildings in Spanish Town in America, in Jamaica, which is just how wealthy these places were, and a modern portrait which connects Asiatic wealth and as they were said in the 18th century, enslaved wealth to British country houses. It meant that there was a large integrated plantation on which enslaved people worked. On the left-hand side here we see Worthy Park, one of the largest slave plantations in 18th century Jamaica, now looking like a wonderful countryside, but in the 18th century full of enslaved people working as you can see here, is a plantation, sort of a factory in the field. The other thing I think that we need to keep in mind is that this transformation did not mean that the enslaved stopped being enslaved. It did not mean that the enslaved would have been enslaved, whatever would have happened. But I think that this period, as I've mentioned beforehand, led to the enslaved having more miserable lives than ever before. And I've got 3 pictures there to talk about the variety of the lives that the enslaved people had. The enslaved people, of course, were mostly workers. They were brought to the Americas to work. They did work, and they worked mainly growing sugar. That's where the most enslaved people went to. And in the American South, tobacco, rice, and indigo. We should always remember that the relationship, that the first and most important thing about the enslaved is that they were workers. But they were workers who were a particular type of workers, because they were not just workers, they were also property. They were property that sometimes did not do what that property was meant to tell. And one of the interesting things about slavery in this period, well known to all of us, of course, but still worth emphasising, is that the enslaved people did not do always what their masters wanted them to do. For much of the 18th century, we need to remember that when they didn't do what their masters wanted to do, the results of their resistance led it into disaster. And here's a really horrible little print from the mid-18th century Jamaica, which is of a country town in the west of Jamaica. This is after Tacky's revolt in 1760, where people are going about their daily business and 2 enslaved people are being hung in gibbets. In other words, they were hung there, starved to death, and then left as an example to the enslaved people. In 1791, that all changed with the successful rebellion in Haiti. But we should not forget that before that, during the period of the slave trade, that the power of the planters was such that any type of resistance from the enslaved would lead to this type of action. But the enslaved fought back in other ways. And at the far end here we have this rather extraordinary gentleman called Francis Williams, who Edward Long, the racist Jamaican historian, devoted almost a full chapter to. Francis William was allegedly freed by the Duke of, was allegedly a free black who was sent by the Duke of Montagu on a bet to go to Cambridge in order to see whether black people were as capable of being educated as white people. And then he became a poet, dressed in English costume, took to wearing a sword, which offended planters a great deal. And wrote poetry. Edward Long spent a whole chapter describing how this poetry was execrable, and showed actually that no black person was ever capable of anything other than mimicry. I think we can think of things in different ways, in that we can see that this is one of these extraordinary lives, and that there were many more extraordinary lives that the enslaved had, even given the terribleness of their condition. So in conclusion, what I want to say is that these pack of knaves that destroyed the Royal African Company in 1708 did so for narrow political reasons. They did so for self-interest. They did so without knowing what sort of forces they had unleashed. But I think that we can look at that particular period and look at that particular example of the ending of monopoly of the Royal African Company, the beginning of free trade in enslaved people in the 18th century, as seeing a turning point in American and Caribbean history, a turning point away from societies that may have had lots of enslaved people, but those enslaved people would have been on small plantations, often not involved in plantation agriculture. The Caribbean could have been like Cuba in the 18th century. Instead, it turned out to be like Cuba in the 19th century, like South Carolina up until the 1860s, and particularly like Jamaica in the 18th century. And these were societies dominated by extremely rich, extremely powerful, and extremely small in numbers, white planters and merchants, collaborating with other ruling elites in Britain, and resulting in some things of value. Sugar is a good thing, after all. The wealth that it brought to Britain did have some benefits, but overall leading to the miserment and misery of large numbers of people who would not have gone to the Americas without the particular events that happened in the late 17th and 18th century. So I hope that one of the things I've convinced you of is that even if you don't agree with my particular interpretation or my particular idea of a turning point, that one of the things that is important, and one of the things that I'm sure the Centre will study in more detail, is how specific contingencies of historical events create particular societies, and that there is a history of slavery that is not timeless, but is connected to politics and economics at particular points of time. And my contention is in the late 17th, 18th century is one of those times we see slavery as being particularly interesting, if you could use that word, in regard to how it helped develop a particular trajectory for American societies, particularly in the American South and particularly in the British Caribbean. Thank you very much.